All right, everyone. As Stacy said, I'm Dieter Mason. I have been working in cloud financial management or cloud FinOps since 2013 at companies like Google, Netflix, Intuit, and most recently Roku. At Roku, I'm part of the Cloud Center of Excellence, which is a very small team. It's my manager, a data engineer, and myself. However, the Cloud Center of Excellence is part of a larger team with 130 engineers, which is called Central Technology and Infrastructure. That team is responsible for data lake, extraction, transformation logic, those kind of things, Kafka, Kubernetes boilerplate install that comes with Loki, Grafana, Prometheus, and Istio, those kind of things. So any engineer at Roku can use a boilerplate Kubernetes install and get those services. We spend about $150 to $200 million annually on cloud, 80%, 80, on Amazon Web Services, 18%, 18, on Google Cloud, and 2% on Azure, just to get us grounded. This is not the first talk. It's actually a talk in a series of talks. So I'm just carrying the torch forward from people that came before me, specifically Amy Ashby, Lindbergh, Matilano, and Chris Reed. All that is available on the FinOps YouTube channel, and you guys can catch up on that. So this is the only time I'm going to read off my notes because I didn't want to memorize that. This is what we are going to go over today. So we're going to look at types of licensing and SaaS, inventory discovery and contract management, pricing models, the contract lifecycle process and negotiation tips, so that's interesting stuff, common pitfalls, the Roku case study, and the key takeaways. So when I started at Roku, I'd typically, as a FinOps practitioner, get a couple of high importance projects that I need to work on, right? But then after some time, the forecasting system is done and a junior engineer can take this over and finance can do monthly business reviews with the lines of business that are having a substantial forecast variance against their budget, right? So other people can do my job at a lower cost point. So I'm typically looking for something that is more sustainable where I can continue to provide value to the business. My go-to used to be in the past cloud waste. Cloud waste are things like orphaned resources, underutilized resources, things that engineers forgot about, right? Unfortunately, when I did a cursory inventory of the cloud waste at Roku, it was less than 1%. To put that into perspective, the shock that I had at that moment was that an industry average is between 25 and 30% cloud waste. So when you think about spending $100 million on cloud, an easy 25 million is spent that does not need to be there. So I desperately needed something to continue my employment at my organization. And because, it is actually the office security staff is surprisingly strict, only allowing employees into the cafeteria, You really need a badge for that to work, to enjoy the free gym and the snacks and the beer on Fridays, those kind of things, right? So while I was working at Roku, I realized that the contract renewals were typically, the vendor came to an engineering manager and said like, hey, you're out of funds or you're coming up for renewal. So at that point, the engineering manager then went and said, how about we renew at current usage? Which you guys probably already know is never a good idea. And then the vendor would cut an order form, the manager would get the budget and get the order form signed, right? So I went to my manager and I said, I don't get the feeling that our engineering leadership wants to work on those contracts, right? And my manager said, yeah, you're absolutely right on that. And I said, look, licensing in SaaS is actually a FinOps capability. That's something that I should be working on. And I think I can do a better job because I can do a forecast and look at the commitment, the total commitment over the contract duration and get better discounts. Some of those products are also relatively interchangeable, so I can get quotes from different vendors and can have the engineering leader make a decision what works best for them. So I can do a better job. And my manager said, Badir, there is about 40 vendors that this team of 130 people are managing. There's a renewal almost every week. You will be very busy. So my internal reaction was, yes. And then I told my manager, well, really honestly, a lot of the projects that I have been working on are coming to an end, right? So I need to really look for something where I can continue to provide value to the business. And so my manager said, let's get started with a couple of things. Let's start small and move from there, right? This talk is going to be about my journey and what I learned, and I hope that some of this stuff is also going to be useful for you. You may know a lot of it, but probably not all of it. This is a slide that the FinOps Foundation has. You can actually turn on and off individual tiles. And this is how licensing and SaaS looks for me at my organization. It will look a little bit different for you at your organization, but that is perfectly fine. And the recording will also be made available a few weeks after the conference, so you can study that more in detail. All right, so you guys can read this off. I'm not going to do that for you. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about my experience and share that with you when it comes to types and licensing and SaaS. One of the first things as a FinOps practitioner, right, not as an ITAM person or as an intersecting discipline, as a FinOps practitioner, if you take on licensing and SaaS, you will typically work on vendors that are very close to the cloud, right? Things like a Splunk, Datadog, New Relic, Grafana, PagerDuty, GitHub, GitLab, those kind of softwares, right? But as you build that muscle and as you sort of build a reputation of being the go-to guy to make those things work, as more vendors or as more lines of business want to procure vendors through cloud marketplaces, you will become that go-to person. And what you work on will slightly change over time. You will get exposure to teams that you typically don't interact with as part of your cloud duties as a FinOps practitioner. And these teams can be something like enterprise engineering. Enterprise engineering at my organization does laptops, Wi-Fi, office Wi-Fi, those kind of things, right? So, but they are also responsible for our HR platform, and this is where payrolling is happening. So you will get exposure to those kind of teams and those kind of softwares as well, right? The next thing that I want to talk about is vertical specific software, right? We have here healthcare and government and those kind of things. For Roku, a vertical specific software are encoding algorithms. So when a movie is being shot, it is actually being shot at a very large resolution, much more than 4K, like 12,000 pixels across, right? And then that movie is being downsampled to different resolutions so that you can watch it on your 4K TV, on your 1K TV, on your tablet, on your phone, those kind of things. So the same movie exists in about 178 different formats. And some of these encoding algorithms have the ability to enhance the viewing experience. So darker areas of the video are being made even darker, while brighter areas are being made more vibrant, right? And there is a galaxy of those vendors that we are using for different features and quality. There is also a document on the FinOps Foundation website that talks about FinOps for software as a service that has a lot more information. You can go there and look this up. So now when you take on a a new role or a new responsibility, it is typically a good idea that you figure out what you are responsible for. And you should do that not just by yourself, but work with your manager to avoid that there's a disconnect, that you believe that you are responsible for these things and your manager believes you're responsible for these other things, and then bad things might be happening in your future. So in this case, I made sure, because I didn't want to take on all 40 contracts all at once, right? I needed to gradually work myself into that role. So it is important that you know what you're responsible for. The contracts have a start and an end date. There's external contact information, and there's internal contact information, right? Who is the business owner? Who is the engineering leader that owns this vendor relationship, right? And when you think about that, and we are going to talk about how this works in a procurement system just in a moment, but when you think about the different vendors and the different scenarios that you could have a merger, right? So you made business with this vendor, right? And now they merge, and all of a sudden you need to make business with this vendor. An acquisition is where you have a business with this vendor, and there's another one, they come and grab this, and now you make business with that vendor. And a divestiture is when you made business with one vendor and they have a business unit that is now being asked to make it out on their own, and all of a sudden you have to work with this business unit. In all of those cases, what does happen is that the vendor entity, the legal entity changes, right? So your master services agreement is probably okay, at least until the renewal. The order forms will be honored because this is how the vendor makes money. However, they will pretty much want to send you invoices right away, right? They are not going to wait for you to get ready for them, right? They want their money pretty much as soon as possible. To be able to pay them, you need to set up a purchase order. And that purchase order has a couple of key items that you need to get correct. The first one is the legal entity. Your legal entity, Roku has multiple legal entities: Canada, US, Mexico, Europe, China, India, and many more, right? So if you're procuring for a different legal entity, you need access in that procurement system to be able to open purchase orders for that legal entity, right? By default, I only had access for the US, so I couldn't do other legal entities. The next thing that you need to know is the cost center that is going to be paying for this contract, right? And those are codes, weird codes that you need to learn and get used to, right? But you need to get the cost center correct. At Roku, we also have a start and an end date because we amortize the invoice amount over that period, right? And lastly, you need to select the vendor in the procurement system. If the vendor doesn't exist yet, you need to set up the vendor. We use a self-service setup where we send a link to the vendor, and the vendor then follows the link and follows the instructions. They provide the legal entity name, they provide the headquarters address, and then the banking information, right? And the banking information is a PCI compliant data set, right? So that is what I wanted to talk about inventory discovery here. Let's take a look at contract management. For contract management, a couple of the things are pretty straightforward, but let's do a simple contract, something like $1 million over 12 months, over a year, right? Two things really can happen. You are at the 1 year mark and you only spent $900,000. So it's called a shortfall. You didn't spend enough, right? The default behavior in that situation is that you owe the vendor a check for the $100,000, right? And let's say you want to talk the vendor into, hey, how about I promise to pay you $1.1 million for the next year? The vendor already knows that you're not able to do this, right? You are now at 900,000. You can maybe get to $1 million, and that's it. So if they allow you to go to 1.1, they still don't get their money, right? So there is nothing in for the vendor. However, if you have a mini business case where you say, look, we spent 900,000, but we just did an acquisition, and that acquisition will add another 200,000 to this. And then both the primary organization and the acquisition will grow organically, right? And I can actually confidently give you $1.2 million. They may be able to forgive you the current shortfall because they see, hey, there's more business in the future. That said, the other thing that can happen is that at the end of 9 months, you are out of $1 million. The default behavior in that situation is that your contract ends, you ran out of funds. That also means that your discounts are now over, and by default, you would go back to list pricing or public pricing. Some of our discounts are over 90%. So such an event would be catastrophic for our finances, right? So in that case, you need to do an early renewal, right? The onus is now on you, where you need to scramble and figure this out and make this happen. So now let's look at pricing models. I already talked about a very simple pricing model, which is you get $1 million over 1 year, right? There's more sophisticated ones, and please go and take a look at the slides as well. One that is very common is like a usage-based pricing model, like vCPU hours. And let's say you pay like for 1,000 units, you pay $100. From 1,000 to 2,000 units, you pay $90. From 2,000 to 3,000, you pay $80. So it gets cheaper the more usage you have, right? That is a very common model. Another somewhat weird thing is that a software or a product may actually be free. However, some features that your engineers are using, you have to pay for those. Also maybe support, right? Support isn't free for that product. So the contract that you're cutting is actually for the extra features or the extra support. Something that I have been seeing now happening in the last 2-3 years with the advent of Gen AI is that you may have token-based pricing, right? So you have like 1,000 tokens with X amount of dollars. And I have even seen some vendors introduce their own currencies like Datadog bucks, right? And so you need some way of translating the currency from the vendor into dollars for it to make sense to you. Now let's take a look at the contract lifecycle process, right? It typically starts with some type of intent, right? You either have a completely new vendor that you're bringing in, and in which case your organization may want to do an architecture review. This is where the architects in your organization take a look at that vendor, take a look at that technology, and determine if that technology aligns with the company technology roadmap, right? So there is a possibility that the vendor may get rejected. The next one is you have a contract renewal, you have an amendment maybe, right? Or you have a statement of work, something like that, right? You could already have an existing relationship with that vendor, but now you're adding something substantial to that relationship. Let's say you're migrating from a call center vendor to a cloud call center, or you are using a content delivery network that is sort of like a cache for movies, using a content delivery network, and now you're moving to a cloud content delivery network, right? During that transition period, you may have 3 months, 6 months, something like that, where the engineers are experimenting with that software, right? So you don't get the full business value from the product yet. And as a result, you can ask the vendor to give you credits for the duration of the proof of concept, or possibly make the proof of concept duration completely free, right? And all of that has to go into a contract, right? You can't just have a verbal conversation and say like, oh, that sounds good to me, Bob, let's go. It has to be all going into a contract, right? And the next phase is the negotiation. For the negotiation, make sure that whenever it comes to commercials, anything with dollar numbers or usage numbers, you are the single point of contact, right? You don't want, and the vendor will try that. They will build relationships to the engineers and the engineering leaders, and they will try to talk with them about technology, but potentially about other things, right? And during the conversation, one of your engineering leaders may say something like, hey, worst case scenario, we are going to pay for the proof of concept. Now, all of a sudden, you talk to your vendor representative and they said like, oh yeah, the credits are off the table because your leadership said that they are okay to pay for it, right? Of course, worst case, they are okay to pay for it, but the intent was to offset it with credits. So make sure you're the single point of contact. At some point, you guys have solidified the conversation sufficiently enough where you have this artifact of an order form, an amendment, a statement of work. And that is the first legally binding artifact. And because it's legally binding, it has to be reviewed. And so there will be a legal review. They will look at things like per contract year versus second contract year, right? They will be very meticulous in the language. If you're procuring for European entities, you have to do a GDPR review, right? Potentially, you have to refresh your data privacy agreement. Data privacy agreement on the vendor side is like a boilerplate. They have been using it for a couple of years. However, California may have updated the data privacy requirement last year, so you need to bring up the data privacy to the current standard, right? And of course, you need to also look at sustainability. What is the sustainability impact of that vendor on your business? And then the contract comes for signatures, right? And there's different signature processes. One example that I had happened to me is the signature was due on Friday, and it was already Friday afternoon, and my e-signature team is on the East Coast, and they went already home for the weekend. What you can do, and is perfectly legal, you print out the entire contract, you take a pen, you sign it, you put it in an envelope, you go to the post office and make sure it's stamped with that date on the envelope, right? It is understood that the thing won't arrive until like Monday, Tuesday, or something like that, but it's a legally binding way of signing a document. It's called a wet signature. It has been good for hundreds of years, and it's still good today. Now, vendor negotiation tips and tricks, right? First and foremost, you should be data-driven, right? If you have no idea what discounts you can get from a vendor, at what commitment level, that's not a good situation to be in, right? Worst case, reach out to a Gartner or to an IDC and have a conversation with them what typical discounts look like. However, as a FinOps practitioner, we have a benchmarking capability. And benchmarking, you do a knowledge sharing session with an organization that is similar in size to yours, similar industry. And during that benchmarking session, you can share ranges. You can share things like I said in the beginning. We are spending $150 to $200 million on cloud, right? And we get a discount X to Y range, right? You can share those things to get an idea of what certain commitment levels result in discounts, right? Forecasting will become important too, and I have a slide for that later. We're going to talk about that. Whenever you negotiate with a vendor, make sure you align internally. When an engineering leader tells you, I can make X amount of usage over Y amount of time, they have to understand that it's sort of like a binding commitment that they just made, right? Because if they come back 2 weeks later and say, oh, you know what, dear, I made a mistake, I can't do this. Now I will look like a fool in front of the vendor. And worst of all, the vendor has to get approval from their leadership, right? And they will look like a fool when they have to come back and say like, hey, customer changed his mind and we need to look at different commercials, right? Be aware of timing that may affect the sales representatives. For example, I had a vendor, their fiscal year ended end of April. So in the last 2 to 3 weeks, that vendor is very willing to make concessions, right? to give you, let's say you have been asking for the overages to be billed at discounted pricing, not at list pricing for a while. Maybe in the last 2 weeks, they will give that to you. They may also be able to give you things that are relatively easy for them to give, but may have some additional value for you, like training, like free support, free training. I typically like to get something like an at-will termination clause. Yes, you still need to give 30, 60, 90 days of termination notice, but if you want mid-contract to switch vendors, now this little clause allows me to do that, right? Obviously, we talked about competition. Assertive communication, because you aligned with your engineering leadership, because you know what the industry standard for these discounts is, because you have a good forecasting system, right? You can now tell a vendor confidently, look, I can make X amount of usage in Y amount of time, and then practice silence, right? Just I lean back in my chair and I think about taking my niece to Disney World, And now the onus is on the vendor to come up with a response. Monitoring and how important it is, right? Let's go and do a couple of examples here. So this is a usage graph of one vendor with multiple products. Each color is a specific product, and there's even like some colors that are really tiny. The y-axis is not dollars, it is usage units. This is why it's there. And so now the question is, this looks like a usage increase, right? At the left side of the graph, we had some type of usage and then something changed. And then on the right-hand side of the graph, there is more usage, not for all of the products, but for some of them. In the cloud, you can use tagging to identify what is that engineering team that is responsible for that, right? Here, the vendor may not have that ability to pull this apart for you. So you need to be able to determine what is the engineering team and what happened here. This is a usage anomaly. Again, there's multiple blue colors. There's a light blue color, and then at the bottom, there's more blue colors. So there's, again, different products that are being graphed here. And you see there's a usage anomaly, right? You need to be able to monitor that usage in near real time, because we had something happen, I think that was this one here, where an engineer turned on logging for everything in the kitchen sink, right? Of course, it was an intern. And the cost was $30,000 a day, right? If you wait until the end of the month, the only thing that you can do is be sad, right? This is already too late. So now we have this one here. Is this a usage increase? It's pretty gradual, right? Or is this a usage anomaly? So when we look at the end of the graph, we see it was actually a usage anomaly, right? Now, I said multiple times, and you guys can read this, why forecasting is important. Forecasting is important not just in the cloud, right? Which may be a very large amount of spend of you, but you also need to be able to forecast for your SaaS and licensing, right? The situation here is that you can take historic data and use different models like Holtz, Winters, Triple Exponential, ARIMA, Profit from Meta, those kind of things, right? But none of these models, there is no AI on the planet that knows that you're going to release a new product in August, right? There is no algorithm that will know that you're opening up your services to another country in December. So you need to model these things. You need to work with your engineering leaders to determine what the impact is. Even a marketing campaign can have an impact on how much let's say I do a TurboTax campaign, right? Like in February, March. People will log into the system just to check it out, what it's all about, even though they won't file their taxes until April 15th, of course, right? So you need to model possibly a ramp up, a sustained plateau, and there could be a ramp down again, right? And all of this needs to be modeled and layered into your organic growth forecasts with all those fancy algorithms that I mentioned before. Now, there's some meat here. Common pitfalls. All of them happened to me. Let's start with the e-signature process, right? So you negotiated a contract with the vendor, and it is displayed here in dark green, right? Now you're ready for signatures, and this process is specifically when the vendor initiates the e-signature. What happens now is that the vendor sends this thing to your leadership. They need to be trained to not just sign this thing. They need to understand that they need to check first. And the reason is some e-signature systems allow you to retract an actual e-signature, but not all of them. If you are in a situation where there is no signature retraction possible, the only thing that you can do is an amendment pretty much right away. So the next thing that your leadership needs to do is send that contract over to your legal department, and they need to validate that the contract that is being sent for signatures is identical to the contract that we agreed upon and that was negotiated. Your legal department then will give a heads up to your leadership, and they can then sign, and that completes the process. Now, if you procure something through the cloud marketplace, for the vast majority, I mean 99.9%, you have to do the first process first, the e-signature process, right? And once that is signed, you go to the cloud marketplace process and kick that off. And this is how this looks like. The vendor sets up a marketplace construct on the cloud marketplace. It will have like the total dollar value, a start and end date. It will have a private offer ID. It can have all kinds of fancy things like vCPU hours and stuff like that, right? The FinOps practitioner may not always be in a situation where they have access to the cloud marketplace, because that needs actually admin access, right? So in that situation, someone from engineering will reach out to the FinOps practitioner and ask, hey, is this okay to accept? And the acceptance is just a mouse click, that's it. That's all it takes. The FinOps practitioner then needs to take that cloud marketplace and user license agreement, or EULA, send it to the legal team and have them double check if the thing that we are accepting on the cloud marketplace is the thing that was signed through the e-signature process. Once the legal team confirms, I let the engineer know, the engineer accepts the cloud marketplace offer, and then I let the vendor know that acceptance just happened. The reason why this is so important is that your legal department, your organization, has an e-signature contract with the vendor. However, the cloud provider has a legal, valid marketplace contract with the same vendor. And if the two are different, the vendor can choose which ones they want to follow. And you don't want the vendor to have the option to choose. Bless you. Next comes something that is, I simply call vendor ability. So you start with, I have an account manager, could be any vendor, could be a cloud vendor, could be a licensing SaaS vendor, doesn't matter, right? And I have a really strong relationship. I make that arrow really, really bold and fat and thick, right? This guy and I, we go way back, we have a great relationship. So I assume that the account manager has a great relationship with leadership, with finance, with engineering, and procurement. For example, if I have a elevated error count on one of the services, and to troubleshoot, I can't tell which vendor is causing the errors. I need to turn vendors off to be able to troubleshoot. However, if I have a monthly commitment and I turn them off, I just now violate the monthly commitment. I need from the vendor leadership the permission to go ahead and turn them off for maybe 3-4 weeks while we are troubleshooting, and we are going to make up for it later, right? And I don't want to do an amendment for that. I just want the vendor's leadership to agree to this. Or I need to change the finances a little bit, so I need approval for finance and procurement. Or I need a new feature. Something doesn't quite work. We discovered actually a bug in the vendor product, and I need them to fix the bug, right? So I need the account manager to have all those relationships. However, this could happen, right? This guy started 5 months ago, and and doesn't have any of those relationships. He can't do anything with me, right? I'm just stuck with this nice, friendly person, and that's it. So be aware of that. That situation exists more often than I might think. All right, Roku's best practices. This is what you have been waiting on. Just like FinOps, it is important that you keep the management of licensing and SaaS centralized, right? You want to be I mentioned that already before, you want to be the central point of contact for all commercials. Technology doesn't care, right? But all the commercial stuff has to be single point of contact. Of course, you need to monitor usage, right? I showed you all the graphs and all the examples. But there is more to it. You remember the usage anomaly, right? The $30,000 per day because of the intern. You need to build strong relationships with the engineering teams that you can fall back on and say, hey, we have this usage anomaly. You need to do something right away. At my organization, I built that reputation that if I send you a message or if I send you an email, something catastrophic is happening. I wouldn't bother with like just a couple $1,000s, right? Something really bad is happening. And we need to act on this right away. And if one of the engineering leaders does not understand that, I can have my VP or my SVP reach out and explain that, no, this is really genuine. He tries to help you, right? There's something bad happening. So you need that ability to collaborate, right? This entire time I was talking about do this, do that, do this, do that. Do not forget, you're not the owner of the contract. You're Switzerland, right? You're facilitating. You're running the negotiation. But you don't own the need for the contract. You don't want to be in a situation where you do a two-year renewal and the business leader comes back to you and says like, hey, Dieter, I actually wanted to phase out that vendor. I don't need them anymore, right? That's a fantastic way to lose your job. So make sure that you are a facilitator, not the owner of that contract. And there is a galaxy of vendors out there. There's always new vendors coming out. You need to stay informed. You need to know what vendors have which features so that you can get quotes and work with the engineering leaders to get the best outcomes for your organization. So in closing, don't feel intimidated to take this on, right? There are many capabilities, they sort of come to an end and then someone else cheaper, can take over and can run with this, right? Don't feel intimidated to go and take this on. It is truly a sustainable practice and you will be able to provide business value to your organization, right? You will need relationships that go beyond legal, beyond procurement. You will need strong relationships with business leaders, with people like privacy, data protection, sustainability, those kind of relationships, right? Last, I want to have you leave here with a cool thing that may be very useful and is pretty easy to do. And this is every calendar system like Outlook or Google Docs, right? They have pre-made calendars like US holidays, Jewish holidays, Islamic holidays, all those kind of things, right? You can make your own calendar. When you make your own calendar, it is of course empty. It doesn't know anything, right? What I do is I put in 90-day events and I call it vendor XYZ renewal. And then anyone can actually subscribe to that calendar. It's just 2-3 steps, right? So I can have my manager subscribe to that calendar so they see what I'm busy with every week. And that is very powerful. All right, and here is the feedback. Thanks so much. And if you guys have questions, please go ahead and ask.
Hi, and thank you.
Hi.
My name is Melina. I'm from Autodesk. I had a question in terms of like the SaaS provider not being able to provide the breakdown by usage, by team.
Yeah.
Usage by team. At Roku, what do you use? What do you use to determine how much the team is using with a certain SaaS or license solution?
It is challenging and different from vendor to vendor, right? Some vendors, you are out of luck. You have to ask around, right? It used to be Bob, and Bob is saying like, oh, dude, Steve just started using this. Go talk to him, right? And Steve is like, yeah, I just launched a new product, right? This is how you may have to figure this out if the vendor doesn't support tagging or any type of cost attribution.
So you're not using any specific tool like Focus right now?
Focus for licensing and SaaS is, still early stages, right? For the cloud, yes, I would definitely recommend everyone use Focus. Any more questions? We still have 3 minutes and 30 seconds.
Cool. You talked a little bit about anomalous usage,
Yep.
but sometimes teams have non-anomalous usage. It just kind of grows. Yes, we want to get it under control throughout the year, but inevitably at the renewal time, that business unit says, "Oh yeah, I've been meaning to
Didn't
clean
happen.
that up or whatever,"
Yeah.
and now you're stuck, right? Your vendor has been counting on your revenue growing, and you're in a difficult place, and the business unit wants to reduce at the time of renewal. Can you talk about have you had that situation?
Yes.
And how do you handle it?
Yes, so that can especially happen if your contract is about, let's say, seats, right? You have like some kind of data visualization tool that is for 1,000 users, and but the vendor does not have the ability. Maybe you host it yourself; it's not hosted by the vendor, so the vendor does not have the ability to surface how many users you're actually using. And what happens in that case is they ask you to do an audit. Right? So you do a self-attestation with, oh, okay, I have X amount of users, right? Before you do that, you do a user cleanup, right? You go and kick everyone out that was laid off, that left on their own, right? And leave only the people that really need access to that system. And then you do your audit and you share those numbers with the vendor, right, to make sure. But yes, I mean, you will have some organic growth, right? Over time, maybe 10%, 15, maybe even 20 if this grows super fast, right? And that's natural. The contract will just grow. I think someone back there had a question, and the woman as well. Can we go over, Stacy? Last one? Last one.
Okay. So for Roku, you might be using hundreds of SaaS, if not hundreds. So what was the reason you picked those 40? Number one. Number two, this skill sets, like when it was for FinOps for cloud, the skill set was standard across all cloud infrastructure. But wherein in SaaS, the subscription models are very, very different. Like Salesforce, understanding the pricing model, even Salesforce doesn't know what their pricing model is.
Yes.
So how FinOps people can learn?
Well, you have to learn, right? And this is why I'm saying at the end of my last slide, it is continuous improvement, right? You have to learn. And there's new stuff popping up all the time where I'm like, wow, that's a thing. You can buy stuff like that, right? But it does happen, especially once you branch out into these HR systems, graphics, design, collaboration platforms, right? They have like weird systems on how they procure. So yeah, you just need to learn about those things, and learning is not enough. You need to know how to optimize it, right? And you need to know how to negotiate with the vendor as well, because a FinOps practitioner, we collaborate, we don't negotiate that much, right? You are a role of your organization, and the sales rep is a role of that organization, right? The two of you are negotiating a deal. You don't want, it's okay to be professional, to be respectful, but I think to be nice or compassionate is misplaced in that situation specifically, right? You need to be able to negotiate and be able to get the best outcomes for your organization, and the other person does it for their organization.
Hey everyone, producer Andrew here. Thank you so much for watching and for your support. For more FinOps X 2025 content, go check out our YouTube channel. Like, subscribe, and leave comments and questions for all of our wonderful speakers. We appreciate your support.